Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this month's satsang with the Yoga Academy of North America. I am Shambhavi. I am administrative assistant for the Yoga Academy, and I will be kind of the co-host for the evening, and I will be monitoring any questions or anything that you need help with. You can either direct your question to me specifically or just put it in the chat. And our topic for this evening is yoga and trauma. And Sannyasi Yogatara will be offering her wisdom on the topic. And as a little introduction, Yogatara first discovered yoga 30 years ago and has studied and practiced in the tradition of the Bihar school for over 20 years. She holds degrees in biochemistry, applied yogic science, and transpersonal psychology, and is a certified somatic experiencing practitioner. After devastating 2015 earthquakes in Nepal, her home for 25 years, she trained and specialized in the renegotiation of trauma. Yogatara draws upon the authentic teachings of Satyananda Yoga, somatic experience, and spiritual psychology to support individuals and communities in need through individual consultations and trainings worldwide. And she has been on the board of the Yoga Academy since 2021. So I'm very excited to introduce Yogatara on this topic. And just so you all know, for the evening, we'll have a short discussion of the topic for about 20 minutes or so, and then move into a short Q&A section with some practices involved there. So thank you very much, Yogatara. Welcome.
Thank you, Shambhavi. Hello, namaste, hari om, everybody. I see many familiar faces and places, it looks like. So I know many of us know each other from different walks of life, different events. So thank you all for being here. And just to begin with, it makes me think of, this is one of the best tools that we have at our disposition to help renegotiate traumas, to come together and connect in community, in positive community. And I'll talk about that a bit more through what we would call co-regulation.
Guess what?
Just
on our way.
Sure that everybody can mute themselves. I think Shambhavi will help that happen. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, super. All right. So I thought before we even start the topic, anytime we begin to work with trauma, it's really good to sort of help ourselves settle and anchor. So I'd like to start with a short practice, if you all are okay with that. And we're going to start sitting up. And I'd invite you to keep your eyes open or soft in their gaze. You don't have to close them. If you're sitting in a chair, which hopefully you are, I invite you to get the soles of the feet on the ground if you can. If you are sitting cross-legged and you can't be in a chair, that's fine. You're going to pay attention to your bum and your sits bones. So even as your soles of your feet begin to plant themselves on the ground, also move your awareness up into your pelvic floor and your bum, feeling your sits bones. So being aware of that base of the body from the feet to the sits bones, and feeling up into the torso, noticing your spine. If you need some support behind the back, you can place it there. And make the adjustments you need so your body feels supported and relatively steady and comfortable. The hands can be placed on the legs or in the lap. And we're going to begin, as we have settled the body, to gently rock the body forward and back. Nothing too big, but just a forward and backward movement. The breath is normal and natural, the eyes gently opened. And the next time that you come through center, you're going to pause And then gently shift that movement side to side. So a gentle rocking movement. And as you do this, become aware again of those sits bones. And the next time that you move through the center, rest there. Placing your awareness around the sits bones and finding a way in your system to help plant them in their support. And if you need to adjust your position, do so your sits bones are anchored, soles of the feet connected to the ground. And then go ahead and place one hand on the chest with the palm open, and one hand right around the belly or the diaphragm. So also the palms open. And let your attention now be on the sense of touch of the hands with the torso. And if you don't have a good sense of touch of those hands, you can gently rub the palms against the trunk or tap the fingers for just a moment. There's no need to change the breath or breathe deeply. You're just watching it and also noticing the touch of the hands on the torso. Finding and anchoring within that touch and within the body. And as you are aware of your own body, extend your awareness outside of yourself into the space around you. Remembering the room that you're in. And even to the space beyond the walls of your room. Remembering the natural world around you. If you have a garden, remembering the garden outside, or if there is a favorite tree that you like nearby, connecting with that. Maybe there's a body of water. Connecting with the presence of that. And noticing again your own body in the space. And connecting also with the other people in this space through Zoom. Aware of their presence, the community. And when you're ready, you can slowly release the hands. Shift your position. If the eyes closed, gently open them and look around your space again, letting the eyes reorient. I thought we would do this. I have some slides to present because I think sometimes it's easy to have, some of us are more visual, some of us are more auditory. So I'm going to do my best with the technology. I'm much better at inner technology than outer. So please be patient for a moment as I figure this out. And as we go through the talk, please, if you have questions, put them either in the chat. You can also, if it feels like more of a private question, you can send them directly to Shambhavi. You can send them to me, but I'm going to have a harder time finding them as I talk. And we'll save them for last. Okay. So the here and now is sort of what we just did, because this is one of the things that disappears in trauma. The here and now becomes very difficult to be in, but we'll talk about that. So for the sake of this satsang, I wanted to talk about 4 things, and we'll see how we do getting through them. One, what is trauma? What helps, what doesn't? How yoga helps. And then I want to talk a little bit about my personal pet peeve, which is an overemphasis on relaxation. And so what to do instead. So some of you may be very aware of trauma, and in the past few years, it's become the darling of psychology, but also social media. And there are reasons for that. We've had a pandemic, which was, you could say, a traumatic event. And it sort of reflects what's happened throughout history, is that trauma sometimes is very much in style, and then it goes out of style. And the research is then we invest research into it, and then we don't. But it really actually came to the forefront after the Vietnam War, at least in the United States, where a lot of research started happening about it. But literally, trauma is translated from the Greek word of the same, and it's a wound. And that would be an apt description of what happens. And I like to say, all trauma is suffering, but not all suffering is trauma. And this is one of the things that has happened recently, is because trauma has become so common a term, everything is trauma now. And it's not accurate. So there's different definitions of trauma depending on what body of work you're coming from, whether it's medical, Western psychology. I worked with a shaman, an elder, for many years in Nepal, and they have their own definition of what trauma is. And so it's been around forever, and different healing modalities have tried to help heal it throughout time. And not all trauma is the same. So just as not every suffering is trauma, trauma that happens, let's say, perinatally, is not going to present the same or have the same effects as the trauma that happens if we've had a really good childhood and then something happens later. And also, trauma is not just limited to the medical diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's much more subtle than that. And I'm saying this from my training and background in somatic experiencing. There are traumatic events that happen, but not all of us are going to be traumatized by it. And I had a hard time believing that, but a friend of mine who lived through the earthquakes in Nepal actually was not at all traumatized, in the sense that it took him a while, but he didn't have the same repercussions, let's say, that I did. So a traumatic event does not necessarily mean that we're going to be traumatized. So it's important not to assume that just because somebody is living through a traumatic event that they have to have trauma. And trauma can affect us as individuals. I think we are experiencing this now, but also as groups, in a family, as communities. It can cross ethnic groups, gender groups, but it can also cross generations. And there's actually more and more research to show this, that the genetic mutations that happen actually persist across at least 3 generations. And yoga is a very helpful tool to help us renegotiate trauma, and we'll see a little bit why. The Satyananda yoga tradition, many of you are coming from that same tradition, is what we would call trauma attuned or trauma sensitive. And there are reasons for that. So if we want to talk definitions, you can look at the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Excuse my incorrect pronunciation of that, but basically it's the American Psychological Association and Psychiatric Association, their definition. I don't agree with all of it, so I choose the definitions, the older definitions that feel that they resonate more. But here are some ingredients of what creates trauma. it's a state of, we could say, extreme negative stress. So stress is actually good for us. Good stress is good. We grow through stress, we develop skills. It helps us perform in the right dose. But when it's negative, then our performance tends to go down and we begin to have negative side effects. So trauma is a state of extreme negative stress. And one very important ingredient is that we have there is a perceived threat. And that perception is important because it means that it's subjective. It's relative to the person that it's experiencing it. So what my system might perceive as a threat might be different from somebody else's. So it's very individual. And it's a threat to one's integrity. So that could be our physical, our body, our intellect, our emotional integrity, our identity. So it can either be our own or somebody we're witnessing. And we often forget that there's trauma through witnessing, and we can see that if we're watching the news, if we are witnessing an accident or abuse or any trauma that's not directly affecting us, but it can be perceived as a threat. Okay, it can have an effect. And along with that perceived threat are certain emotions like fear or terror, but the big one is powerlessness. There's a sense that I cannot do anything. So all of these ingredients combined together are what make a rich concoction for trauma, for us to be traumatized, to have a traumatic experience. From a somatic point of view, we understand that actually trauma is a response in the nervous system. It's not in the event, it's a response from our nervous system. And it's a dysregulation. We'll talk a little bit about what that is, but maybe you've heard of that term. And you could basically say it's when too much is happening too soon. A colleague of mine gives the reference point of trying to drink water out of a fire hose. That's what creates trauma. That intensity, the volume, it's just too much too soon. So this is from the work of Dr. Peter Levine. Maybe you've heard of him. He is the person who came up with the technique of somatic experiencing. And his point, you can read the quote, but basically traumatic symptoms are never in the event. They're not in the war. They're not in the accident. They're not in the medical trauma. But they happen when whatever energy our system has to awaken, to mobilize, try to get us away from that threat, when it's not fully discharged or integrated, then this leaves, it stays stuck in the nervous system. So think of having your car on and you've got the gas pedal down and the brake on at the same time. There's no way where for all that petrol that's being pumped into the engine to go. It gets thwarted somehow. And it creates havoc in the nervous system, but also on our psyche, in our mind, and in our energetic field also, we would say from the yogic point of view. So what happens is, well, there's big biochemical changes that happen and neurological. So our lower brain, our survival brain will tend to kick in. And which means that our upper brain, particularly the neocortex, which is responsible for organizing, for planning, for thinking things through, we don't have as much access to that. If our system has all that energy and that trauma energy in it, it actually changes how we have access to all of our brain function. So we'll see those changes happening. There's this real fragmentation. So if you're a yoga instructor or you go to yoga classes, I've seen this happen before where I'll ask a student to lift their right leg and they lift another part of the body. There's a disconnect from the body, and we call that fragmentation. So there's fragmentation physically. We might not be able to feel all the parts of our body. We might feel like we're not fully there. But there's also fragmentation in our emotion, fragmentations in our thought process, but also that fragmentation and disconnection to ourselves and to other people, to the world. So often our world becomes smaller because we are more easily triggered, let's say. We have less of a space that we can maneuver in. And so we're limited. And we can often feel cut off from the flow of our life. That's a term we use in SE, somatic experiencing. And again, we really get disrupted from being in the here and now. So people who have PTSD will often get, part of that is intrusive thoughts and images. It's very hard to be here, which is why yogic practice can help us so much in helping us connect to our body, which is one of our anchors in the here and now, but also slow things down a bit and be able to tolerate that a bit more. Also, I think it's relevant for the times now that we are in globally, as so much is being shaken up, is to recognize that one trauma or traumatic event even can trigger earlier trauma. And this is one reason why some people react to a traumatic event differently than others. In yoga, we call this pratyaya, right? We have these samskaras. We have all of this material that much of the time we're not conscious of. And it's when something sort of activates it, like a traumatic event, that it starts to come to the surface and is ready to be looked at, but can also in the meantime create a lot of havoc. And we'll wonder, well, why am I reacting? You might have heard this before. You could have asked it to yourself or to somebody else. Why are you reacting so strongly? Like overreacting. We'll tell people you're overreacting. They're not overreacting. They're reacting based on their samskara, based on the story in their system. So again, this is where yogic practice can help us a lot. And again, trauma can be dormant. We can be going along, thinking everything's just fine, and boop, all of a sudden it wakes up. And we often will see this happen in midlife, later in life. And there are various reasons because of that. And I put a little side note for myself and for us there that says, trauma is seductive. I remember one of my professors in SE teaching me this as she would have to keep pulling my body back from when I was working with somebody because I would be leaning in. And this is exactly what happens to us. I mean, look at the news. What's on the news? What are we paying attention to? What's on social media? What do we often talk about is traumatic material. And it's like a vortex. It will suck us in, which is, again, why a practice in yoga such as sanyam, right? Understanding how we can restrain and direct our attention and what we're giving our attention to and having restraint on that is hard, but helpful. So some things that trauma can look like, and this is by no means exhaustive at all. Trauma is often very subtle. But this is the first one on the list is probably something you're well aware of, hypervigilance. And that could be even us constantly feeling like we have to check our phone for a message from somebody or the news. We're hypervigilant about what's happening. We're hyper reactive. Also, we might have a big startle response to any sensory input, sounds, smells, certain types of touch. Because trauma is something that lives in the body and the nervous system, particularly our senses get affected. If we don't have explicit memory of it, our body has implicit memory of everything that's happened. And it's keeping a tab on it and trying to keep us safe. So it's going to become hyper aware of senses in particular. Other than those, we'll see people or ourselves disengage with what we used to be interested in. and disengaged from life. Again, that's part of that isolation. Difficulties with sleep, with memory, with concentration are common, but so are other systems in our body affected, like our digestion. Chronic indigestion, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, are, doctors call it that, but they're often an outcome of chronic inflammation, which is a result of chronic stress, meaning there's a trauma probably, and I shouldn't say probably, there's a potential for there to be trauma in the system if we have chronic stress. So disruptions in appetite, in sleep, and digestion, and hormone, we'll see very physical manifestations of trauma. So if you are somebody who teaches yoga, you might have people coming in with this and wondering, what is going on? Chronic pain, chronic fatigue are also outcomes often of traumatic energy being in the system. And then there's all of the emotional responses that might be happening, like avoidance, but also aggression. And we often see not extremes, but they can be extremes, but volatility emotionally, difficulty in modulating our emotions. Sometimes we won't feel certain emotions, but we'll feel other emotions very strongly. And guilt, shame, fear, or are prevalent for people who are living with trauma. All of those come from our nervous system. Our nervous system, that you probably heard of this, the autonomic nervous system's responses of fight, flight, and freeze. Oftentimes these are seen as less evolved responses. Actually, they're part of our wisdom. In my opinion, they are, if you think about it, the remnants of millions of years of living beings being on this planet. We call the reptilian brain because we share it with reptiles. And we have in there, encoded in there, everything that a reptile does to stay alive. And we need these responses to keep us alive. The problem is when they overtake our life and rule it without us having any ability to have choice beyond them. So some things that can help. And if we are lay people, it's really important that we don't feel we have to do everything, but it's like, how do I help the people who've been through the fires in LA or any natural disaster, or maybe a family member who's really dealing with a lot of difficulty? You know, if you've been in a plane, most of us probably have, but the directions we're given on takeoff is, if we lose pressure, first put your oxygen mask on before helping somebody else. It's the same thing with trauma. If you feel that you're getting activated by somebody and you're going, oh, what do I do? What do I do? First, put your oxygen mask on, which is to connect with yourself, to help yourself regulate, to stay present with yourself, which is sort of the practice we did in the beginning. Any variation of that, you might have other tools that you use. But when we regulate ourselves, we actually help the other person have a reference point for them. Not just the other person, but the collective. Because our nervous systems are wired with one another. They're also wired with the natural world, right? So our self-regulated presence is often the strongest medicine. And self-regulation doesn't mean we have to be calm. It just means we have a way to help ourselves become a little less activated and a little bit more connected. If we're working with people, it means that we're very clear. We have good boundaries, which can be terrifying at times to say no to people, but that we're genuine, that we have empathy, but also that's not pity. There's a difference. And it's something that we can each work on, I think, individually, is how to have empathy versus pity. and not need to save people. Now, that's hard if we're a parent or we're very close to somebody who's having trauma. But to trust in that person's agency, to trust in their nervous system's ability to restore itself and to be autonomous. Another thing we can do is to offer people choice. So if we think that if we remember one of the main ingredients of trauma is powerlessness, then one of the medicines in the right dose is choice and agency. So do you want to sit here in the classroom or there? Any little choice and help people figure out what choice they have can be very helpful. And then also knowing where your resources are. That might be community, your sangha. That might be therapists nearby. It might be a hotline. It could be anything that helps. So resource is something that helps us stabilize and become a little bit more steady, but also people who might be trained to help. So we don't have to do everything on our own. Things that we want to avoid are overexposure, sort of really limiting how much of the trauma information we take in. And I think nowadays that's really crucial. There's a lot on the news, there's a lot in social media. And so practicing that sanyam of, okay, maybe I watch it half an hour in the morning. That's it. Half an hour in the afternoon. Probably not before we go to bed. Probably not helpful, right? Because then the system can get triggered again. So in that same choosing, so not overexposing ourselves to the information, but also not isolating ourselves, finding ways to connect with helpful links. And also, sorry, I have a dog here. I should have told you that in the beginning, who is not used to me being connected with people at this time of the evening. I'm supposed to be with him. So also to avoid forcing ourselves or thinking that we should be relaxed. Calm and relaxation are not always necessary. We shouldn't be calm when the house is on fire. No. No. So again, it's allowing ourselves to do the right thing and then having a way back to connect to ourselves and to connect to our sources of support. Spiritual bypassing, I put there just because we're in a yoga field. And I'm not sure if people are aware of spiritual bypassing, but it's sort of using spiritual concepts or practices to avoid doing the work and feeling the emotions that we feel. You know, I've actually had a parent say about a child that they were neglecting. Well, that's her karma. So there's an example of using spiritual verbiage to avoid dealing with a situation. That's very broad, but I think we have to be careful about using terms like karma and any other sort of thing that might take us away from actually sitting through and working through what's being asked to be worked upon. And you might know this quote by Swamiji, Swami Niranjan, a quote I keep very close to me. That yoga begins not when your mind is contented, but when the scales are heavily loaded against you and when you're facing overwhelming problems in your life. That's when the real work and the real practice begins. I'm just checking time. I have just a few slides left. Shambhavi, she's very good at keeping me on the dot. So some ways that yoga can help is if we equate yoga at first, let's say with asana and pranayama, very, very helpful for ourselves, but also for working with students to teach them how to self-regulate. But first of all, just to recreate a connection with our body. Emotions are biochemical reactions. We feel them physically, and they change our chemistry. When we live with trauma, our body can become a very uncomfortable and can feel like a very dangerous place to be. It's uncomfortable sensations. Guilt is a very uncomfortable emotion, an uncomfortable feeling. We might have sensory overload. So anyway, things such as asana and pranayama help us restore a connection to the body that is more friendly, where we can begin to feel more at home in the body and actually be in the body more. And self-regulation is, I had forgotten to mention it earlier, but basically, very simply, being able to shift ourselves from a state of relative disorganization, so feeling a bit disconnected or frantic, to relative organization. And I think the key word to remember, if you remember anything from this satsang, is relative. It's all relative. So we don't have to be calm. We might just want to be relatively better, just a little bit. Pranayama, even before pranayama, working with the breath is very powerful. And it's like working with nuclear energy. So work gently with it. A little bit goes a long way. Natural breath, a 1-to-2 ratio, meaning we're breathing in for 1 count and breathing out for double the count. And internal kumbhak, I find. And all of those help with what we would call vagal nurturing, helping the vagus nerve step in and our relaxation response come on. Something simple that we did in the beginning, hands on the chest and the belly. A sense of touch, a certain type of weight, all of that can be helpful. And then this idea of expanding and contracting, allowing the body to be able to do expansive movements and then coming back. So again, having choice. Mantra are another favorite of mine to use. But beyond what we can each do as individuals or with individuals in a group, I think what we often forget is the tools of co-regulation that yogic practice brings us through connecting with community, through connecting with nature. Yoga ecology is a practice, whether preparing the food that we are going to eat, tending to a plant, looking at the sun, all the ways that we can find connection and healthy connection and supportive connection. Kirtan is another big one. Karma yoga is very helpful. It can give us a sense, or people were working with a sense of agency, that they can actually do something. Something that I'm doing is actually working towards a goal. There's an outcome and a positive outcome to it. And yoga also gives us, as a life science, a new framework in which to sort of reconsider ourselves. So these can all, if you're a yoga instructor, you can consider looking at that also. One of my last slides is this myth of relaxation. So again, I love Yoga Nidra. If everybody here is familiar with this, it's a guided practice of deep relaxation and a practice of pratyahar. Very powerful, very helpful. For people who are living with trauma, I would say go very slowly. Relaxation is actually not the opposite of trauma. And it doesn't necessarily, just by doing relaxation, we don't necessarily create a healthy nervous system. A healthy nervous system is one that can go between a stress response and a relaxation. Again, that choice. I can get happily stressed or even a little distressed, and then I can find my way back to relative ease. We want mobility. So just relaxing sometimes will take people actually into the freeze response. One of the trauma responses, being freeze, is actually a parasympathetic response. So it's a muscle we get to learn gradually. We have to build it. So you could do other things like seated practice, helping people feel their body, helping ourselves feel our body anchored, relatively stable, finding support, moving fluidly, not too quickly, but with the breath. And again, that focus being on where do I find relative support in my system, in my body? Where is it relatively easy? Where do I have a bit more space? If you're dealing with people or you are somebody who lives with trauma responses, that can actually be like a pretty big exercise, right? Because everything is wound and fragmented. We can also look at developing and finding areas in which we can play and have some creativity, do creative activities and joy and be connected. And again, that choice. So if you are somebody who works with people with trauma, consider that everything else that you do that's not yoga nidra or not a deep relaxation can also be very much helping with that. So this is my last slide, Shambhavi. And so here are some questions that we can ask ourselves and ask other people. The first one can be a tricky one, because if we're deep in our trauma vortex, what can I do right now to help myself? That we might not have an answer. Feels like that I don't know what to do to help myself. But it's also something, if we are a bit more steady, can also help ask ourselves if we're not deep in our response. But again, that question, where in my body does it feel relatively better? Not super, but a little bit better. Or where in my body do I feel a little bit stronger or steadier? So those are some questions we can ask ourselves or ask other people, even if we're guiding them. I'm going to close there, and I know that's actually a lot of information. So I'm going to stop sharing, if that's okay. And open the floor for questions or comments. If you have things that you disagree with, you're also welcome to put them in. Or things that you did agree with.
And you're also invited to either raise a hand or if you want to ask your question out loud or in person, feel free to do that.
You can also ask questions about what do I do now in the current situation. I mean, it's fine. The floor is open.
Yugatar, I have a question.
Hi, Rich.
Hey, so the last slide you said where in my body, and for some reason as you were talking the last 20 minutes, you know, when you talk about trauma, I have this one place in my back that just seizes up randomly. There's never been an explanation. I know it for 10 years. But when you talked about where in my body, I don't know, something shifted in the last 2 minutes. And it was really profound. And now it's actually acting up again. But so I wonder if you can just go back to that last slide and talk about go back to it for a sec.
You want me to show it?
Yeah, there's something that happened that
Okay, absolutely. Can you see it?
Yeah. It's really powerful, and I don't know what happened, but when I read it again, it's like, where does it, because I was looking for, where's that safe space? Where's that, how do I feel? And everything else in my body feels fine. And then it's just that one place. And I know something's going on if I'm in an uncomfortable situation.
Yeah.
For some people, it's your lower back. For me, it's kind of lower left shoulder. And I've had people work on it physically. And but to be able to somehow manifest or focus or cue in on, but I'm not sure that that's what the intent of that slide is. But I just wonder if you could talk to where my body, does it feel relatively better or a bit more at ease? Even when I say that, I'm like, I just feel better about it, but I don't quite know how to access that.
Thank you, first of all. And the practice, I think what, if I can use your example, is, so the pain in the back is, let's sort of say, that's the example of what we would call a trauma vortex or trauma is. It's a group of symptoms that are quite intense. And what happens is our brain is designed to focus on what's danger, what's uncomfortable. So all of our attention will go there. And so it's what we call dual awareness, and we do this in yogic practice also, to be able to have choice about where our awareness goes. This is a lot of yoga nidra training, right? We go through the body, but to be able to feel that and go, but where else? Is there somewhere else in my body other than that place where I'm feeling such discomfort that comparatively feels a little bit better than that? So I'm not abandoning, hey, my back doesn't feel great there, but can I at the same time sort of find a place that feels a little bit better? And then see what happens when we hold both. And it's almost like we give that part that's so concentrated some more space by doing that. Does that answer your question a bit?
No, it's funny because all of a sudden a lot of my back started to respond. No, I'm going to play with that. Thank you.
So yeah, clearly it's a question that worked for your system.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Monica, you have a question?
Yeah. So first of all, I think your presentation made a lot of sense. And I'm working as a social worker, and your description of trauma as a vortex is a description that I've used in the past, of getting sucked into someone's trauma vortex and being very aware that it just like consumed me and took me over. And now I am experiencing what they're experiencing. So I definitely resonate with that concept. And I think maybe just a bit of discussion about, I'm very aware that I don't always manage to stay regulated when I'm encountering other people who are dysregulated. And I don't always manage to recover very well afterwards. And I can tell that the stress is accumulating. And it's something that, you can say it's great that I'm aware of it. But it's something that bothers me because it feels like, well, I'm not very good at my job if I'm getting dysregulated and not recovering. And, I'm just going to be another burnt out social worker. So, yeah, I think just any sort of further thoughts that you can share about that topic.
Thank you for sharing that, one, for the work that you do, because social workers are often the unsung heroes. We talk about therapists, but the work that social workers do is just phenomenal. And for your honesty. And I think it's one of the areas that people in the healing arts, and so I'm going to say social workers, therapists, even yoga instructors, let's say, who are working with people with at-risk communities, or anybody, because trauma walks through the door all the time. I think we're at high exposure to being dysregulated, and part of what makes us good at our job is we're sensitive, and we tune in, we're attuned. So it's really, I think, a lifetime work of doing that. And I understand exactly what you mean. I remember one of my teachers saying, you have to, and I know it's not always possible, but if you can decide how many people you're going to work with, and to say no to certain cases. And it depends on who you work for. If you're working for a government organization or an organization, that can be hard to do. If you work for yourself, then it's a bit easier. But to know when our system is overtaxed, and it does get overtaxed. And that's a real, it's a real phenomenon. And I think it's being able to share in spaces and really find other people that we can commune with and that can help us co-regulate, allowing ourselves to have joy, to be goofy, to laugh. I mean, if you've been in an ER or in a room with trauma therapists, you don't want to hear the bad jokes that are out there. I mean, there's that sort of humor that comes, but any type of humor can be helpful. But I think what you're talking about is very real. And are you also a yoga practitioner?
Yes, although it's not a very solid practice right now. And I try to go back to it, and it does help when I do. But it's been sporadic.
Yeah. For me, that's a lifeline. And I think we have to find the ways that we do it. But even if it's 5 minutes of a practice, whether it's a physical practice or a breathing practice or a mantra, faith often plays a big role in people dealing with that, because what we encounter when we're working with trauma or we're in a traumatic event is often a search for meaning. Like, how could people do this, or how could this actually happen? And so there's often also a spiritual component to it. And if we have some link of developing, or some way of, if that speaks to you, of building that connection, it can be helpful. But I'd say anything that helps you be with you, even if that's being accompanied by another person that will help you be with you, even 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I find that helpful. And for me personally, I have to say no. I have to limit how much I work.
Yeah.
And yeah, we can't help everybody. And that's one of the moral, there's also moral wounds that can create trauma. And so somatic experiencing is another technique that really helped me. And we're sending out a PDF with helpful connections and websites and places, and they often give some introductory talks and even teaching some basic techniques there. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Monica.
I appreciate the discussion. I mean, it's something I need to figure out for what works, but it helps to, even just the validation of like this, you said it's a lifetime work, right?
Yes.
Like it's not that there's something wrong with me if I haven't figured it out in the first few years, kind of thing.
No. Oh gosh, no. No. Anybody who tells me that they see 10 clients a day in private practice, I'm like, I'm not so sure about that. I have a hard time.
Yeah.
They might be able to, but the repercussions at some point, they might have those. So I see. Is it okay if we move to the next question, Monica?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have David was next that I saw, then I have one coming in, and then Blair.
Hi, how you doing?
How do you?
We've read Peter Levine's book and understand a lot of different kinds of trauma therapy that are out there. But I was wondering if you could share a little more detail about an experience of a somatic reintegration that has had a pronounced effect afterwards on a traumatized person's life, a person who's experiencing life impacts from trauma. Something, because it's one thing to read the books, and it's another to actually be able to experience it and have something, understand what does it take to go from everyday experiences that might be difficult to one that actually creates meaningful change.
Thank you for the question. I agree. It's hard to explain what somatic experiencing is actually in practice. And Levine has put out a few books to try to explain actually what happens in a session. But so let's see, an experience. So
Yeah, like a release where something came out.
So we're talking about, there's one thing to release stress energy, and it's another thing to discharge and then integrate. So some of the symptoms that we'll see happen, and I do a course on this for yoga instructors to help recognize what a trauma release can look like when we often think it has to be cathartic. In SE, we don't want to work that way. We want to work very slowly so it's not overwhelming. But oftentimes you might see shaking in the body. You might feel tingling. There might be a deep breath in and out. Tears are a form of discharge of traumatic energy. Did I say shaking already? But it almost feels like from the inside there's a reorganization happening. So it's not just about the energy being released, like you might see somebody's leg just start to shake. Okay. But then once that's released, then having that leg sort of come back, be part of the body again, and sort of helping them feel that new connection of the leg with the body, with the whole system. Another example, let's say, is working with veterans, people who have been in combat, who have very little tolerance for auditory stimuli. Walking down the streets, let's say in Kathmandu, was horrifying for this person. They would get very disoriented, very aggressive, get very angry, and they'd have to leave or find a place where they could hide. And so with SE, for example, what we do is help them begin to have more control over that. To say, well, I'm only going to take in this much sound, and then I'm going to do this sound, and then I'm going to listen to this sound. And you actually help them become more tolerant of sound. And you do it in person with them. Does that answer your?
That gives me some ideas, yeah, and it's some good things to work with. Yeah, thank you.
So there's a great YouTube of Dr. Levine working also with a Marine veteran who was in one of the recent wars, Afghanistan, I believe. And this young man is on 10 or 11 medications. He has a severe tic. Okay. He was survived an explosion in which several of his friends perished. And he was on antidepressants, anti-tic medicine, he'd been diagnosed with everything. And within the first 15 minutes, Dr. Levine helps him basically undo the tic. And the way he does it is to have him slow down the movement, which is what we do in SE. You slow the movement down that's so automatic. And then, because what the body's trying to do is complete the movement it needed to do to orient to that danger. And it wasn't able to do. So we're going a bit into detail of SE as a technique. And I think you bring up a great point that there are many different tools that are around to help heal trauma. EMDR is another one, brain spotting. All of that to say that I think it's important that the body be included and not just talk therapy for trauma resolution, because it's not just cognitive, and we often don't have explicit memory of it. It's in the body. David, is it okay if I go to the next person?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Blair, I'll let you ask, and then I have another questions that has come in the chat. So Blair, are you there? Okay, so I will go to the question that came in, and then if Blair's back on, we'll come. How to find balance in these apocalyptic times. I think we would have that. I'd invite people to put their suggestions in the comment, because honestly, I think this is something that we do together. I can only speak from my personal sense, and I think it's easy to become overwhelmed by everything that's happening. Part of what I think is necessary is to be aware of what's going on and to have some connection to ourselves and to some sense of normalcy. It's even if that's calling your friend or going to the store or doing some normal things. And I say this as somebody who's lived through 2 massive earthquakes that were very traumatic. I also lived in Nepal during a 10-year civil war and a 21-day siege. And so I've had experience with a lot of social unrest and potential danger. And what's always impressed me is how powerful community is in helping us find sanity and support. And the truth is, it's not normal. Like, it's not normal. It's very uncertain. I think yogically, we would say Sangha, continuing with your sadhana. Again, anything that is going to help you connect with the deep knowing in yourself, the deep, deep knowing that is within you, that connects all of us. And that's what yogic practice helps us do. That's what SE can help us do. That's what other therapeutic tools can help us do, is find a home within ourselves, a safe space somewhere within us, even if we have fear. And I'm not going to use the word hope because I think it's not always easy to have hope. It can be, yeah. You don't have to have hope to be able to make it through. The other practice I think is helpful is to take up our space, to be as here as we can be, and to be in your body as a human being, to feed yourself well, to treat yourself well, to speak who you need to speak with, to be here. Because one thing that fear does, and that people who want to make us afraid will do, is to contract us. Fear makes us contract and get small and hide, which on the one hand is very helpful, but in the long term is damaging. So what's almost more revolutionary is to feel the fear and to find how much space still we can be here. So fear, people will use fear to get our lower brain over ambitious. And so we get disconnected from our capacity to see, our capacity to organize ourselves, our capacity to think forward. So those are my 2 cents, but I think we have, oh.
I think Blair is back online, so maybe
Okay.
we can address her question.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry. Hi, Yoga Tara.
Hello.
This is fascinating and wonderful. And I'm actually reading a really interesting book right now on trauma, the internal family systems, no bad part.
Mhm.
And so this is really timely to have this today. Thank you. I had a couple comments and a question.
Yes.
I love to think about boundaries because I never think about boundaries within yoga. Boundaries seems like a separate thing, but really boundaries are the root of all of our healing. So that was really great to think in the relationship to yoga. And also not to pity when you're helping someone. That was also really helpful. My question was under the myth of relaxation. I thought that was really interesting because I often think that relaxation is like a total way for healing. But I think what I heard, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, is you're looking at relaxation more as a tool to get you to a place to overcome trauma. Is that right? Like the question I had was, you said that relaxation does not create a healthy nervous system. Is that right? What you said on that slide. And so Can you speak a little bit about that? Because I thought, oh no, relaxation would definitely create a healthy nervous system. So
We need to, yes, we need relaxation. It's one ingredient to a healthy nervous system. But it doesn't, just because we can. So one thing we'll find is we understand that in yoga, we talk about Ida and Pingala, right? The masculine, the feminine, the right nostril, the left nostril, in sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. So we want to have the capacity to be able to swing at will and direct ourselves how to swing. So yes, relaxation is a crucial ingredient for people who live with trauma, but it's not just the answer. It's not the antidote. They also need to, when we have trauma, we need to also, it's something we need to learn how to do. It's hard when you have trauma stored in your body. And you'll see, I say this because the reason my learning curve was after the earthquakes in Nepal's 7.8 earthquakes. I was like, well, as a yoga therapist, I've been taught that yoga nidra is like the thing to do. So I was trying to get people and myself to do yoga nidra. Now, the ground still shakes after a massive earthquake for months. There's no way nobody could lie down and do yoga nidra. And I was thinking, something's wrong with us. No, actually, something was very right. Our brain was not going to allow us to, it had registered the ground is not stable. Do not lie there. Do not stay still. Okay, so relaxation after trauma is something that we have to relearn how to do drop by drop, slowly, slowly. It's a real muscle. And when I've also seen people who go into deep relaxation, because the nervous system swings, if we take them too quickly into a deep relaxation, it will swing back in equal amount and sometimes more. So this is why you see some people do a yoga nidra and they're like, that's amazing. And then an hour or two later or the next day, they're completely overwhelmed again and even more. So again, it's something we want to, it's an important part of healing trauma, but we want to do it slowly and drop by drop, which is why the Satyananda yoga approach of such a systematic way of teaching things. That's why it's so trauma attuned. We do it systematically, consistently, slowly.
that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Purgative practices to release blocks. You mean like shatkarmas? Absolutely. Under supervision. Cleansing practices, the shatkarma are wonderful. I'd start just with neti and breathing. And only to do the heavier cleansing techniques really under supervision. Absolutely. The end of Kali Yuga. I'm not an astrologer. I don't know. All I know is that I've somehow decided to be born in this time dimension. So I'm staying the course as best I can, but no, not to make light of it. I actually work with a Vedic astrologer, so I haven't heard any discussions from the ashram about this. The only directives I've seen is for Swamiji to tell us, and this is something he's been, at least I have been hearing in his talks for many years now, is to develop our positive qualities. He's been saying this over and over again. Stay on the bright side of your garden. Don't ignore the shadow, the shade, what's in the shade, but put all of your energy into developing your positive qualities. This is the spiritual path, the Pratipaksha Bhavana. Because think about it, if everybody were doing that, wow. But not to, and any little thing that we can do any little amount of positive action, feeling, thought that we can have counts. It contributes to the collective, not just our own, but to the whole. And so if it's chanting your mantra, if it's saying thank you when you wake up in the morning, if it's calling somebody who's in need, if it's trying to correct your, I don't know, some of your shortcomings, everything counts. That's the only thing I've heard. And it's actually hard to do. So I think I got my work cut out for me.
I think that was a lovely and positive way to end our session this evening. And thank you so much for your wisdom and your time. And this is a very timely topic. And we will be sending out a copy of a recording of this event tonight to those who have registered. We'll also be adding, I think you said you have a PDF that we're going to add to that as well, with some information and other ways to find some more information on this topic. And yeah, we're glad you could be here. Next month, we have Swami Prembhav, who is going to be talking about yoga ecology. And that date, I believe, is March 16th and at 7 p.m. So hopefully you will join us again next month, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you so much.
Good to see everybody. Thank you for coming in community. It's really lovely to see you. Hari Om, and be safe and be well.